Hey, this is Sky. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Go check out my website at skysworld.com for life coaching and mentoring. You ever heard the phrase, pioneers get killed by savages? It's the truth, and it's a rule of business. When you're thinking about starting a business, you're an entrepreneur, and you want to start your own business. You're thinking of different ways that you can provide a service or a product, and you're just wondering, well, what do I do? What do I do? Should you, here's the philosophical question that a lot of people get into. Should you invent something new, come out with a product or a service or something that's never been seen before, totally brand new? You created something that is just this new thing. I think a lot of people have that idea with business. At least they have a misconception that that's what business is about. But I hate to break it to you, but Nike didn't invent the tennis shoe. They just did a great job in selling it. So it is often suggested in business school and by consultants that instead of being an inventor, instead of being Tesla, you think more along the lines of Edison. You think more along the lines of fads that have already been going and that you can capitalize on. Things that people are already doing, and how can you take something that somebody is already doing and make a slightly better version of it? Hence the tennis shoe. I wear Chuck Taylors. I love Chuck Taylors. I'm about to get another set of Chuck Taylors in the mail today, according to UPS. The Chuck Taylors suck. They're terrible shoes. And Nike came along and said the same thing. Fuck these Chuck Taylors, man. I'm building a real goddamn shoe. And the guy sat in his garage and built a fucking shoe. I think that's how Nike started, right? And some American in his fucking garage trying to come up with something new. But he didn't invent the shoe. He didn't have to invent sneakers. All he had to do was improve upon it. And this is a really good way to think about how to start a business. You don't have to invent landscaping or invent some service within landscaping that no one's ever done before. You know, bonsai waterfalls, nobody cares. Just be the best goddamn landscaper in your town. The most professional, the most on time, best rates, whatever it is. Differentiate yourself slightly. And that is a really successful model. I've had problems with that. I'll be honest with you. I'm a trendsetter. And the problem with pioneers, one of the reasons why they get killed by savages, that's the statement, that's the phrase, the age-old wisdom, is because you're too early. You may be the first doing something. A lot of people may think that you're weird. They may think that you're crazy. They may not understand you. And then you kind of just crash and burn and fizzle out. But there was some people paying attention, and usually the second wave of people will pick up a fad, identify something that they think is cool, that's already being done, and then they'll capitalize upon it. So hip-hop was like this. Hip-hop started in the streets, breakdancing, graffiti, rap music. It started as a form of competition between gangs. You can look up the history. I'm going back to the 70s. You think old school is NWA. I'm going back to when NWA were little babies, back in the 70s, when hip-hop began. It was in the streets. Corporations hadn't gotten onto it yet. There was no such thing as Run DMC. There was no such thing as the hip-hop radio station. There was R&B stations that played Diana Ross and James Brown. This is what I grew up with. And if you wanted to experience what hip-hop was, a lot of people had no idea what it was. This is before the movie Flashdance came out and exposed it, before the Michael Jackson video, before anybody's seen it before. It existed in the streets, in urban areas, and it was on a Friday or Saturday night, and you actually had to leave your goddamn house and go out in the middle of the night to a party that might exist at a park, and there'd be a DJ set up, and he might be pirating the fucking electricity off of somebody, or somebody was nice enough to let him use it. And there'd be some guy on the mic calling people out. Hey, Rhonda from the Bronx, or whatever. And that was the DJ hip-hop experience. You might see some cats graffitiing on a wall or on a train, and it was a form of artistic self-expression. It wasn't necessarily just tagging gang turf like you guys do now. That's not hip-hop. your MS-13 graffiti has nothing to do with hip-hop. So where am I going with this? Hip-hop existed as an underground subculture, and it was started by this first wave of pioneers, people like Kool Herc. Well, Kool Herc didn't end up a billionaire. Dr. Dre ended up a billionaire. Because the people who come after, they're usually accepted more, and they can capitalize on things better. All Dr. Dre had to do was join a scene that had already been around. He came in the third or fourth generation. This guy's my age. People that are my age came in to hip-hop in like the third or fourth generation, when we were finally old enough to participate. It had already been going on. And people act like, oh, you invented it, you invented it, you invented it. You think that Sugar Hill invented rap. They didn't invent rap. Sugar Hill was a boy band created by a record company. I'm not trying to be insulting. But, I mean, it was a scene that had gone on, and Sugar Hill was a perfect example of a second wave of people that just came after the pioneers. Because the guys that started it were these idiots in the park that could barely do it. That's who started it, but nobody remembers them, nobody cares about them. Punk rock happened very similarly. There were punk rock bands in the early 70s that people just didn't get. And people were looking at these punk rock bands and these fruitcakes that didn't even know how to play their instruments, flopping around on stage looking like idiots, and it was just, the whole experience was uncomfortable. It wasn't, you know, people were used to Led Zeppelin, who really got into their instruments, and they're going to sit there doing drum solos and guitar solos and, you know, singing really well. Punk was nothing about that. Punk was the exact opposite of that. It was just pure message. And the music aspect of it, if you're lucky enough to get a beat in there to tap your foot to, and even dancing to it, people were slam dancing. We didn't call it moshing, we called it slam dancing, which when you first saw slam dancing, you didn't even know what it was. You'd be like, is that a fight? You have no idea what's even going on. And they weren't accepted. Punk came out in the early 70s, and it fizzled out and died, and they were just a bunch of fruit balls that people thought were weirdos. And then all of a sudden you had the Ramones, you had the Clash, you had the Sex Pistols, you had this next wave of punk bands, and they became millionaires, packing stadiums. And people asked them in interviews, they asked the Clash and Joe Strummer, where did you get this from? And he mentioned these fruit balls from the 70s that you guys didn't like. Bands like the New York Dolls and these other bands that just really never made it. That's where punk came from. But all we know about is who comes after. The pioneers always get killed, they go off into nothing. And why am I telling you this? You may be a trendsetter, and it may be particularly frustrating to you that everything you try fails. Well, you can either continue being the trendsetter, which trendsetters are valuable. Without pioneers, we wouldn't have America. We wouldn't have the West Coast if we didn't have a couple surveyors decide to go into the wilderness, right, and start exploring. And they hit the Oregon Trail, and they finally hit the West Coast. Without them, we wouldn't have what we have, right? So pioneers play an essential role in evolution of culture, of trends, of society. You're important, even if you're not noticed, and there's never a statue going to be built, and you're going around saying, I started that shit, man. And everybody's like, yeah, right. You matter. Trust me, you do. The world needs you. But if that's too frustrating, and it is for a lot of people, then you want to start thinking more like a hustler. And this may feel like you're selling out, and in some ways you are. And you're going to pick something that people are already doing, and you're just going to simply capitalize off it by tweaking it a little bit. But that's capitalism. That's business. It's food for thought.